Food truck owners become part of the festival family, trusted vendors who show up at every event, know the regular customers, and understand the rhythms of community gatherings. People felt comfortable around his truck, talking freely while they waited for their orders. But when those casual conversations started revealing patterns of drug distribution, his years of undercover training made it impossible to ignore what he was hearing. Welcome to Silent Heroes. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden vigilance in unexpected places, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Carlos Rodriguez had been operating Abuela's Kitchen food truck at festivals throughout Central California for 8 years, serving authentic Mexican street food that had earned him a devoted following among festival goers who sought him out at every event. His bright yellow truck with hand-painted artwork was a familiar sight at music festivals, craft fairs, and community celebrations that drew families from across the region. At 47, Carlos had built a reputation as one of the most reliable and friendly vendors in the festival circuit, known for his homemade salsas made from his grandmother's recipes, perfectly seasoned carne asada that kept customers coming back, and the kind of warm customer service that made people feel like they were visiting family rather than buying food from a commercial vendor. Carlos's festival route included over 30 events annually, from small-town harvest festivals that celebrated local agricultural communities to major music events that attracted thousands of visitors from across California and neighboring states. His customer base included festival regulars who followed the circuit from event to event, local families who attended celebrations in their own communities, and tourists who discovered his truck while exploring California's vibrant festival culture. The food truck business had provided Carlos with steady income while allowing him to be part of community celebrations that brought people together around music, arts, and shared cultural experiences that strengthened social bonds within diverse communities. Festival organizers trusted him to provide quality food service that enhanced their events. Fellow vendors considered him a valuable colleague who helped create the collaborative atmosphere that made festivals successful, and customers knew they could count on excellent food and friendly service at every event throughout the season. Festival life had a rhythm that Carlos understood intimately after 8 years of traveling the circuit. The early morning setup when vendors arrived in darkness to prepare for crowds that wouldn't appear for hours, the steady rush of hungry customers during peak afternoon and evening hours when lines stretched away from his serving window, the late evening cleanup while music continued and festival goers enjoyed the final hours of community celebration. Carlos knew which festivals attracted families with young children who needed kid-friendly food options, which ones drew younger crowds interested in adventurous flavors and late-night dining, and which events required vendors to be especially vigilant about security and safety concerns due to alcohol consumption or crowd management challenges. The festival community had become Carlos's extended family's vendor relationships that had developed over years of working side by side at events, festival organizers who relied on his professionalism and quality service, and regular customers who looked forward to seeing his familiar truck at every event they attended throughout the year. But Carlos Rodriguez wasn't just a food truck owner serving authentic Mexican cuisine to festival crowds. He was former Special Agent Carlos Rodriguez, Drug Enforcement Administration, with 15 years of service in undercover operations that had taken him from rural marijuana cultivation investigations in Northern California to international cocaine trafficking networks operating along the Mexican border. Carlos's DEA career had specialized in undercover work that required him to infiltrate criminal organizations while maintaining cover identities that could withstand scrutiny from suspicious drug dealers, who were experienced in detecting law enforcement surveillance and eliminating threats to their operations. During his federal service, Carlos had spent 15 years learning to recognize drug distribution patterns that appeared innocent to casual observers, identify criminal communication methods that used coded language and subtle signals, and gather evidence while appearing to be engaged in legitimate business activities that provided cover for intelligence gathering. His undercover assignments had ranged from posing as a small-time drug buyer interested in purchasing personal use quantities to establishing fake businesses that provided cover for investigating major trafficking operations that moved hundreds of kilograms of narcotics across international borders. Carlos had developed expertise in reading criminal behavior that indicated when people were involved in drug trafficking, recognizing organizational structures that suggested sophisticated criminal networks, and identifying the subtle signals that indicated when seemingly innocent activities were actually components of carefully planned drug operations. Carlos's DEA career had ended with early retirement following a shooting incident during an undercover operation in Tijuana that had left him with permanent hearing damage in his left ear and post-traumatic stress that made continued undercover work impossible due to hypervigilance and anxiety that compromised his ability to maintain cover identities safely. The incident had involved a trafficking organization that had discovered his law enforcement identity through a security breach at the federal level, resulting in a violent confrontation that had killed 2 of his team members and left Carlos hospitalized for 4 months while recovering from gunshot wounds and the psychological trauma of losing colleagues who had become like family during years of dangerous assignments. The betrayal that had led to the discovery of his identity had destroyed Carlos's faith in institutional law enforcement and convinced him that individual vigilance might be more effective than bureaucratic systems that were vulnerable to corruption and security failures that could cost agents their lives. The transition from dangerous undercover work to peaceful festival vending had been perfect therapy for someone who'd spent 15 years living false identities while constantly at risk of discovery by criminals who wouldn't hesitate to kill federal agents who threatened their drug operations and financial interests. Operating a food truck allowed Carlos to work with people in positive, celebratory contexts rather than the adversarial situations that had defined his DEA career. Instead of investigating criminals and building cases for prosecution, he was serving families and contributing to community events that brought people together around shared cultural experiences. For 8 years, Carlos had deliberately avoided analyzing festival activities for signs of criminal behavior that would have been valuable intelligence during his DEA years. He developed selective blindness to suspicious conversations, unusual customer behavior, and the kind of organizational patterns that might indicate drug distribution networks operating within the festival community. Carlos had trained himself to see only hungry customers seeking authentic food, fellow vendors working honest businesses to support their families, and the kind of community celebrations that brought diverse groups together around music, arts, and cultural traditions rather than criminal activities that exploited public gatherings for illegal purposes. His customer interactions were designed to be purely commercial and friendly, avoiding the kind of personal questions or behavioral assessments that might remind him of the investigative work he'd left behind. Carlos's relationship with festival communities was built around food service, cultural sharing, and positive community involvement rather than the suspicious scrutiny that had been necessary during his narcotics enforcement career. The peaceful routine of weekend festivals had provided exactly the kind of healing that Carlos needed after 15 years of confronting dangerous criminals and living under constant threat of discovery and retaliation. Serving food to happy families had allowed him to remember why he'd originally chosen law enforcement: to protect communities from threats that destroyed the social bonds that held neighborhoods and families together. Festival work had also allowed Carlos to maintain his connection to Mexican-American cultural traditions through his grandmother's recipes and authentic cooking techniques that honored his heritage while serving diverse communities that appreciated authentic cultural experiences. But this Saturday afternoon at the Riverside County Music Festival was different. This Saturday afternoon, Carlos began noticing patterns in customer behavior and vendor interactions that triggered every investigative instinct that had been trained into him during 15 years of narcotics enforcement. The festival was unusually busy for early afternoon, with crowds that seemed more focused on moving through vendor areas than enjoying music or browsing crafts. Carlos noticed that many customers were making brief stops at multiple food trucks and craft booths without actually purchasing items, behavior that suggested they were conducting business that had nothing to do with festival activities. More concerning, Carlos observed that several vendors were using communication methods that resembled the coded signals he'd learned to recognize during his DEA career: subtle hand gestures, specific positioning of merchandise, and brief conversations that appeared casual but followed patterns that indicated coordinated activities. During a brief lull in customer service, Carlos overheard a conversation between 2 young men waiting in line behind his truck that included references to party supplies, weekend inventory, and connections at the next stop terminology that could refer to legitimate festival activities but combined in ways that suggested drug distribution planning. Carlos realized that his peaceful festival community might have been infiltrated by a drug distribution network that was using legitimate vendor activities as cover for trafficking operations that were exploiting the trust and collaborative spirit that made festivals successful community events. The festival that was supposed to be a celebration of music and culture was about to become an investigation that would force Carlos to choose between his peaceful retirement and returning to the world of narcotics, enforcement that he tried to leave behind permanently. Carlos continued serving customers while his trained instincts automatically began cataloging additional indicators that confirmed his growing suspicions about criminal activities disguised as legitimate festival business. The patterns he was observing weren't random, they indicated systematic organization that suggested experienced drug dealers who understood how to exploit community events for trafficking purposes. Several customers approached his truck with the kind of nervous energy that belonged to people conducting illegal transactions rather than families enjoying festival food. Their orders were simple and quick, but their real focus was on scanning the area around the truck and making brief eye contact with specific individuals positioned at other vendor booths throughout the festival grounds. Carlos recognized the behavior from his DEA years, customers who were using food purchases as cover for drug transactions, treating his truck as a meeting point where illegal business could be conducted while appearing to engage in normal festival activities that wouldn't attract law enforcement attention. Most significantly, Carlos observed that several vendors were displaying merchandise in patterns that resembled the coded signals used by drug distribution networks to communicate availability, prices, and transaction locations without using verbal communications that might be overheard by undercover agents or concerned citizens. A craft booth specializing in handmade jewelry was arranging displays in configurations that changed every 30 minutes, behavior that suggested they were communicating information to customers who understood the significance of specific arrangements. A food truck selling kettle corn was positioning their serving window equipment in ways that appeared random but followed systematic patterns that indicated coded messaging. During his lunch rush, Carlos noticed that many customers were receiving text messages that caused them to change their movement patterns through the festival grounds, suggesting coordination by someone who was monitoring law enforcement presence and directing criminal activities to avoid areas where police or security personnel might observe suspicious behavior. Carlos realized he was witnessing a sophisticated drug distribution operation that used legitimate festival activities as cover while coordinating transactions through communication methods that would be invisible to anyone without specialized training in narcotics enforcement. The criminal network was exploiting the trust and community spirit that made festivals successful by using authentic vendors and genuine festival goers as unwitting cover for drug trafficking that could destroy the safety and family-friendly atmosphere that drew people to these community events. Carlos faced a decision that would determine whether his peaceful festival community remained safe for families or became permanently compromised by criminal activities that would eventually drive away honest vendors and destroy the cultural celebrations that strengthen community bonds. During a brief break in customer service, Carlos activated communication protocols he hadn't used since his DEA retirement, reaching out to former colleagues who had transitioned to task force positions targeting drug trafficking at public events and community gatherings. Agent Morrison, this is Carlos Rodriguez, former DEA. I have eyes on what appears to be organized drug distribution at Riverside County Music Festival. Multiple vendors involved, sophisticated communication systems, systematic coordination indicating professional operation. The response was immediate. Carlos, we've had reports of increased drug activity at festivals throughout the region, but haven't been able to identify the network or methods. Can you provide detailed intelligence on what you're observing? Carlos provided comprehensive analysis of the criminal patterns he had identified, including vendor positions, communication methods, customer behaviors, and organizational structures that indicated a trafficking network that had successfully infiltrated the festival circuit throughout Central California. Morrison, this isn't opportunistic drug dealing. This is systematic infiltration of legitimate festival operations by experienced traffickers who understand event security and law enforcement limitations. They're using authentic vendor credentials and community trust to distribute narcotics to families and young people. The federal response confirmed Carlos's worst fears. The drug network he had identified was part of a larger criminal organization that had been targeting community events across multiple states while avoiding detection by traditional law enforcement methods that weren't designed to recognize criminal activities disguised as legitimate festival business. Carlos's accidental discovery was providing the breakthrough that federal agencies needed to identify and dismantle a trafficking network that had been operating successfully while destroying the safety and integrity of community celebrations that were supposed to bring families together around positive cultural experiences. But Carlos also understood that his continued observation was creating personal risk that could result in the same kind of violence that had ended his DEA career if the criminal network discovered that their operations were being monitored by someone with federal law enforcement background and the expertise to provide evidence for prosecutions that would result in significant prison sentences. Carlos made a decision that would determine whether his 8 years of peaceful festival life were permanently over or whether this incident would force him to return to the dangerous world of narcotics enforcement that had nearly cost him his life during his final DEA assignment. Instead of withdrawing from the situation and allowing federal agents to conduct traditional investigation that might take months to penetrate the criminal network, Carlos would use his food truck business as cover for gathering real-time intelligence that could expose the entire trafficking operation before they could relocate to other festivals and continue exploiting community events. Morrison, I'm positioned to conduct immediate intelligence gathering using my vendor credentials as cover. The criminal network trusts food truck operators as part of the festival community, which gives me access they wouldn't provide to obvious law enforcement personnel. The federal response was immediate. Carlos, you're authorized to gather intelligence, but this operation must not compromise your safety or alert the network to surveillance activities. Federal tactical teams are 2 hours away, but we need detailed intelligence on organizational structure and evidence collection before we can execute arrests. Carlos began conducting undercover observation while maintaining his normal food truck operations, using his DEA training to document criminal activities without alerting the trafficking network to federal interest in their festival operations. Over the next 3 hours, Carlos's intelligence gathering revealed the complete organizational structure of a drug trafficking network that included corrupt festival organizers who provided vendor credentials to criminals, legitimate vendors who were being used as unwitting cover for drug distribution, and customers who were using family festival attendants to purchase narcotics for distribution in their home communities. The criminal network had achieved what federal agencies considered the most dangerous development in community drug enforcement: permanent infiltration of family events that were supposed to be safe spaces where children could experience cultural activities without exposure to criminal influences that could normalize drug use and criminal behavior. Carlos documented evidence that showed the trafficking operation was using festivals to distribute narcotics directly to teenagers and young adults who attended events with their families, exploiting parental trust and community safety to access victims who would be difficult for traditional drug dealers to reach through normal street-level distribution methods. The scope of the operation included festivals throughout California, Nevada, and Arizona, with plans to expand into family-oriented events in other states where community trust and limited law enforcement presence would provide optimal conditions for drug distribution disguised as legitimate vendor activities. But Carlos's undercover work also attracted attention from security personnel within the criminal network who were trained to identify potential law enforcement surveillance and eliminate threats to trafficking operations that generated millions of dollars in revenue for organized crime families. During his final hour of intelligence gathering, Carlos noticed that his food truck was being monitored by individuals who weren't participating in festival activities but were conducting systematic observation of vendor areas where drug transactions were taking place. Carlos realized that his DEA background might have been discovered through the same kind of security breach that had nearly cost him his life during his final federal assignment, and that the next several hours would determine whether his intelligence reached federal agents safely or whether he would become another casualty in a drug war that followed him from his law enforcement career into his civilian retirement. Carlos activated his emergency communication protocols and transmitted complete intelligence about the trafficking network to federal coordination teams while preparing for the possibility that his cover had been compromised and that violent confrontation might be necessary to protect both himself and the festival families who were being exploited by criminals. Morrison, complete intelligence package transmitted. network includes 12 vendors across 6 festivals, systematic distribution to minors, estimated weekly volume suggests major trafficking operation. My position may be compromised, request immediate tactical response. The federal response was immediate. Carlos, tactical teams are 40 minutes out. Can you maintain cover until backup arrives? Carlos understood that 40 minutes was an eternity when dealing with experienced drug traffickers who had demonstrated willingness to use violence against anyone who threatened their operations, but he also knew that abandoning his position would allow the criminal network to escape and continue exploiting community festivals for drug distribution that could destroy the safety and cultural value of family events throughout the region. At exactly 6:47 p.m., as the festival's evening music performances were beginning and families were settling in for the final hours of community celebration, federal tactical teams executed coordinated arrests that dismantled the most sophisticated drug trafficking network ever discovered operating within community festival circuits. Carlos's intelligence had provided the detailed evidence that federal prosecutors needed to obtain warrants for arrests that included corrupt festival organizers, criminal vendors using authentic credentials as cover for drug distribution, and transportation coordinators who were moving narcotics between events using legitimate vendor equipment and vehicles. The operation resulted in the seizure of over 200 pounds of various narcotics, financial assets worth more than $3 million, and evidence of distribution networks that had been targeting family events across 6 states while avoiding detection by traditional law enforcement methods. Carlos's food truck had served as the perfect observation post for gathering intelligence that exposed a criminal organization that had successfully infiltrated community celebrations for over 3 years, distributing drugs to teenagers and young adults while exploiting the trust and collaborative spirit that made festivals successful family events. But the real victory was measured in smaller, more personal terms. The families attending the Riverside County Music Festival were protected from criminal exploitation that could have exposed their children to drug trafficking and normalized criminal behavior in environments that were supposed to strengthen community bonds and cultural traditions. 3 months later, Carlos stood in a federal courthouse in Los Angeles, testifying in proceedings that would result in convictions for drug trafficking, conspiracy, and corruption charges that included racketeering violations under federal organized crime statutes. His evidence had provided prosecutors with intelligence that dismantled a criminal network spanning multiple states and protecting hundreds of community events from criminal infiltration. Carlos's testimony was crucial for convictions that resulted in prison sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years for criminal organization members, including corrupt festival organizers whose betrayal of community trust had enabled systematic drug distribution that targeted families and children. After the trials concluded, Carlos received recognition from the Drug Enforcement Administration for civilian assistance that had resulted in the most significant community-based drug trafficking arrests in the agency's recent history. But Carlos also received something more valuable, the knowledge that his retirement years could continue to serve communities that deserved protection from criminal exploitation. Carlos returned to his food truck business with a new understanding that his festival work could serve dual purposes, providing authentic cultural food experiences for families while maintaining vigilance against criminal activities that threatened the safety and integrity of community celebrations. 6 months later, Carlos began working as a consultant with the DEA, training other festival vendors, event organizers, and community volunteers to recognize signs of criminal infiltration while coordinating with specialized law enforcement teams that could provide rapid response when festivals needed protection from trafficking networks. Carlos's experience demonstrated that retirement from federal law enforcement didn't mean retirement from community protection, and that civilian occupations could provide unique opportunities to identify criminal activities that traditional law enforcement methods might miss due to resource limitations or access restrictions. The trafficking network that had exploited festival communities was completely dismantled, but Carlos knew that other criminal organizations were probably developing similar methods to infiltrate community events while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies that weren't trained to recognize sophisticated criminal operations disguised as legitimate festival activities. Carlos's new consulting work would help protect both honest festival vendors and the families they served from criminal exploitation while ensuring that community events could continue providing positive cultural experiences without becoming platforms for drug distribution that destroyed the social bonds that festivals were designed to strengthen. 8 years after leaving federal narcotics enforcement, Carlos had discovered that some service to community never really ends. It just finds new ways to protect innocent people from criminal organizations that see community trust as a vulnerability to be exploited rather than a strength to be respected and preserved. The festival circuit that had provided Carlos with peaceful retirement became the setting for his most important contribution to drug enforcement, proving that community-based vigilance by trained professionals could be more effective than traditional investigation methods when criminals attempted to infiltrate family events and cultural celebrations. So now I ask you, have you ever noticed suspicious activity at community events? Have you met someone whose background prepared them to recognize dangers that others might miss? Share their story in the comments, because quiet guardians like Carlos deserve to be remembered. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Silent Heroes. We're here to honor the people who understand that protecting communities requires constant vigilance, even during celebrations that are supposed to be safe spaces for families. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the person serving your food at festivals has spent years learning to recognize when criminals are exploiting community events. And sometimes that expertise protects entire families from dangers they never knew existed.